Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Zeynep, who is a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and also the author, the co-founder, and president of the Good Jobs Institute, which builds on the work that went into these books. This one, which came out, I think, 2014.
2014, right?
Yeah, the Good Jobs Strategy, how the smartest companies invest in employees to lower costs and boost profits. And then this has been followed up just recently with this one called The Case for Good Jobs, how great companies bring dignity, pay, and meaning to everyone's work. Welcome, Zeynep.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg.
Well, look, this latest book, it elaborates on what you did in the earlier book, but it also walks through a lot of case studies from projects that you've worked on, right? With folks that were attracted to this idea by, I guess, reading the first book. I've taught operations. I've also taught HR and management. And, these disciplines are oftentimes thought of separately, right? In other words, what you do with your human capital and what you do with your systems, they seem to be in different silos. I guess I'm allowed to use that word, right? And I think what you're doing, and I guess you teach courses on service operations, and it's really in service operations where it really becomes important that you coordinate, right, your people management and your systems. And companies like Google now talk about people operations. Is that a recognition? Do you think that companies have begun to recognize this insight of yours, that you need to think about your people and your people development and the working conditions along with the processes that you're developing?
First of all, that's a perfect way to introduce the work. Thank you for that. But I think those two roles are still pretty much in silos. Like when I talk to my colleagues, and I grew up, I'm an operations management professor, and I grew up studying the Toyota production system. We focus on how to constantly improve value for the customer. Now, when I talk to my operations colleagues, it's all about the work, right? How do we make that work productive? How do we make the work so that we can create high quality products at low prices, flexibility, responsiveness, etc. But the needs of humans are oftentimes, not completely ignored, but not important enough, right? If you look at the Toyota production system, they have you taught operations, so you'll appreciate this. They have that house of Toyota, but in the bottom foundation of that house is stability in people. So operational excellence does not work without stability in people. It does not work without respect for people, which is one of the principles of Toyota production system. If you look at the HR world, there's great work on leading people, developing people, career ladders, pay, but the work part is oftentimes missing. So I try to connect those two, and other academics had connected those two before as well. John Paul McDuffie from Wharton had done that when he studied U.S. auto manufacturing, decades ago. So I'm not the first one to do that, but those are still in organizations seen as silos, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, I also teach strategy now, and one of the big things we talk about in strategy is how these things are complementary, right? In other words, you can't, right, have a marketing initiative which doesn't work well with your manufacturing and so forth. But it seems, and you point out that, yes, there's a good job strategy and a bad job strategy, but the bad job strategy seems to be the dominant paradigm. And you point out how when companies bring on MBAs to run their companies, they tend to lean in the direction of the bad jobs strategy. Why is that? Why are we doing that in our MBA schools?
Yeah.
Like, why are we emphasizing that perspective?
Yeah, and that's the study of Daron Ajamal and his colleagues who found that when when they looked at CEOs, MBA-led CEOs were more likely to pay their workers less, and they didn't have productivity gains. So why is it that we're generating these types of leaders? And I think we can talk a lot about the MBA education, but the mindsets in business since 1980s have been dominated by seeing labor as a cost to be minimized and market pay as being the right pay, as if humans are like commodities,
Like
maybe
electricity,
supply
right?
and
It's just this
demand,
undifferentiated,
undifferentiated,
quantity.
as if every company for that same role, the contribution of that role is the same. And there's this thing, lean and mean is efficient. So these have been the dominant paradigms in so many schools. And I'm also afraid that in a lot of business school, we're now generating more and more spreadsheet thinkers, students who are longing for an answer, and doing quantitative analysis, and more looking at business like science. I think, Charlie Munger said this many years ago, how in business, there's physics and me. We think that everything could be reduced to cause and effect, and more we're teaching business like a science. But business is not science, right? It's quite different. Like if you look at Newton's second law of motion, force equals mass time acceleration, it holds. It's universal. It's the law. It always holds, right? If I push this cart with twice the force, it will accelerate twice as fast. Business doesn't work that way. If I raise pay, what's going to happen to profitability? Well, it depends. There are so many connections. There are short-term, long-term effects. There are recursiveness. So the more I think we emphasize the science part of business and want to show the cause and effect of every single thing, the more we go toward that bad job strategy world.
Well, but I mean, wait, that is sort of suggesting that the good jobs strategy is kind of, mushy and feel good. But
Oh,
in fact, you point out that no, it's just that we're measuring the wrong things in the wrong ways, right? And what I'm kind of puzzled by is that, in operations, we always talk about trade-offs and we always talk about optimum, right? So there's too much, you can have too few employees, you can have too much employees. You can pay too much, but you can pay too little. So why is it that we don't naturally start thinking in terms of trade-offs when it comes to paying our workers, right? And doing promotion and investing in our capacities and so forth?
yeah, I'll give you an example, Greg, from capacity management, right? The thing that comes as close to a law in operations, of like physics, is queuing theory, right? And any student of queuing theory would know that in a system with some variability, you would never target nearly 100% capacity utilization, because the queue length goes like super high, right? And it's not a linear relationship.
I
Yet
mean, this is what happened with COVID, right? With our hospitals,
with our
because we were,
hospitals, yes.
right?
And it will happen. I mean, if you're ever driving, right? If you, and anyway, let's not get into the mechanics of queuing. So we know that targeting 100% capacity utilization is not the optimal. But if you look at a lot of organizations, there's no slack in the system. When it comes to humans, we can't even imagine providing slack in the system. So why is that? I don't know. I think part of it is because we haven't invested in the people. We operate with high employee turnover, and there's no trust in humans in the organization. There's no trust in their ability or their goodwill, because high turnover is so prevalent. But just because something is optimal doesn't mean that leaders or managers are going to choose the optimal strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like part of the problem is what you referred to. I mean, I call it ceteris paribus thinking, right?
Uh-huh.
And I think you called
Yeah,
it,
all
I
else.
forget. Yeah, all right. So, it's easy for us as theorists, and maybe this is where the MBA is the problem, because part of what we teach people in the MBA program is kind of ceteris paribus thinking. Like, let's just assume all the other variables are constant, and now let's manipulate this one thing. And what that does is it kind of ignores feedback. So if we assume that there's going to be high turnover, then we're going to design the workplace in a certain way, right? But if you design the workplace in that way, it's just going to reinforce the high turnover, right?
Yeah, and that all else equal frame thinking is a huge barrier to adopting a strategy like good job strategy, because the good job strategy, it might be helpful to just describe it. It has two connected elements. One of the elements is heavy investment in people. So paying workers enough so they can make a living, providing stable schedules, offering career paths. So that's one component of the good job strategy, investment in people. But the other component is creating highly productive and motivating work, which creates a high return on that investment in people. And by the way, that highly productive and motivating work creates amazing outcomes for the company and their customers as well. And that highly productive and motivating work has four components that I've found out after I studied companies that were creating amazing outcomes for their customers, employees, and investors at the same time. So if you look at a system and say, hey, I'm going to change pay. I'm going to increase pay of the workers because I learned from this MIT professor that good job strategy is a good job strategy, is a good thing, and see what happens. Well, pay alone is not going to do anything. Pay alone is not going to do anything if the work is designed for high employee turnover. Pay alone is not going to do anything if there is not a high performance, high expectations type of environment. Pay is not going to do anything if the work is designed and there are so many tedious things that people need to do, so they can't by design be productive. So we need to look at an organization as a system and logically identify what are the different components, how are they linked together, how do they work together to create the outcomes that we want to create. And this is where the scientific thinking can get in the way, because it's not that systems view. It's like, if I raise pay, what will happen to profitability? Well, when you raise pay, did you simplify the work? Did you standardize the work? Did you empower people? Did you also think about career paths? If not, then how pay affects performance will be very different.
So your bad job strategy could be a local maximum, right? And so, if you just change one thing, it might actually make things worse, right? Because you'll have a higher wage bill, but then you won't get any of the benefits that you would hope to get from the higher wage bill.
Yeah, and one of the papers that I wrote with Hajir Rahmanidad and System Dynamics paper. It's a more theoretical paper, but there are two maximums. So the bad job strategy can also be profit maximizing, just as good job strategy. There are two optimas, and in between, if you just do a little bit of each one, then that's not going to generate the high profits.
So, good job strategy might be frequency dependent. In other words, maybe it's not something that everybody can do, right? Not everybody can't pay efficiency wages, right? Everybody can't pay above average. You need to have maybe some bad companies out there coexisting with the good companies, right?
I don't, obviously not everybody can pay more than the market. It's not logically possible. However, in every industry, in a lot of industries, I can see multiple companies pursuing a good job strategy, because what is beautiful about business, and this is where strategy part comes in, right? Like, why do we teach strategy, operations, HR, marketing separately? But even in the same industry, you can see different companies competing differently. I'll give you an example. In the warehouse club industry, where BJ's, Costco, Sam's Club compete, Costco and Sam's Club compete very differently. Costco is, great products at the lowest possible prices, and the experience is it has a lot of friction, right? They haven't been heavy users of technology. In the digital world, they haven't been ahead. Sam's Club uses a very different strategy. Still high quality products at the lowest prices for their members, but they create a frictionless experience and they want to make it as fast as possible. Costco is not interested in that. So here we have two different companies pursuing different competitive strategies, and they can both have a good job strategy. They can both have a highly capable, motivated workforce that drive high productivity, that drive low prices, and that drive great customer satisfaction. So I can see a lot of companies in the same industry using the good job strategy as long as they have a differentiation in the eyes of their customers and they're improving their value continuously using the strategy. It's not good jobs that differentiates. It's the customer value that is a source of competitive advantage.
Yeah. Now, before we dig into the different components of the good job strategy, I guess one question I would have is, why is it that so many senior executives seem to be kind of clueless about what's happening in their organizations? Because I think, in the most recent book, you start with awareness. And it seems like most CEOs aren't even aware of the working conditions. They're not even aware of the complexities. They don't. And I love that TV show, undercover boss, right? And the reason why it's so appealing is because that it's so rare that a boss will. I was just teaching in my digital strategy class yesterday. I was asking my students, like, how many of them have ever worked in retail? My MBA students. How many of my MBA students have ever worked on a factory floor? And it's actually amazing how low that number is, right?
On the first day of my class, when I introduce it to my students, I say, my strong recommendation, before you graduate from MIT Sloan, get a frontline job. Get a frontline job because there are two things that you'll do differently. First, you'll be a better leader. You'll have a lot more empathy for the people that you'll serve. You'll understand how the system that they operate in fails them every single day. And second, you'll see how the decisions that are made in the home office make their lives and their work miserable, and they can't be productive. They can't serve the customer. They can't do a good job. So I think one of the reasons why some senior leaders are unaware is exactly what you said. They don't spend enough time in the front lines. Michael Porter and Nitin Nori, I think, had this study, and they looked at CEOs and how they spend their times, and I think 6% of their time was spent in the front lines. So you look at leaders like Isadore Sharp, who founded Four Seasons Hotels, or Jim Sinegal, who co-founded Costco. They spent a ton of time in the front lines, seeing where work happens. And then I think the other is so lack of time in the front lines prevent them from seeing how work has gotten so complicated. People don't have enough time, or sometimes they don't have enough work. Sometimes they don't have enough time. But secondly, I think as a society, we have been so removed from the those who have it versus those who don't have it. I was surprised how unaware senior leaders were about the financial conditions of their frontline workers. Pay is such an important determinant of people's ability to live with dignity. And a lot of senior leaders had no idea how much they were paying their employees. They knew how much they were paying hourly for the most part, but in service industries in particular, take-home pay has two components. It has hourly pay and it has number of hours. And if you look at industries like retail, fast food, what you'll see is there are a bunch of part-timers. Even full-timers don't get to work 40 hours a week every week, and their schedules change all the time. So your income not only is low, but is so unpredictable. And so many senior leaders are just unaware because they can't even put themselves in the shoes of those workers who are constantly making trade-offs in terms of, do I pay rent this month or do I put food on the table? I can't take my child to the emergency room. One of the, in one of the chapters start with a company where their executives were volunteering at a food bank. And then and the food bank's executive director said, it's a lot of your own employees who come and benefit from our services. And they were shocked. Like, they were paying above the market. And they're like, really? How can that be? And when they did a study of financial wellness, they found something like 2/3 of their call center workers could not make ends meet. So that's the world we live in. And you ask our students what motivates people. Everybody's going to talk about it's a sense of belonging, achievement, meaning, recognition. Of course, those things are the motivators. But so many people don't have their basic needs met. And there's tremendous lack of awareness. And those are oftentimes the biggest reasons for employee turnover that I've seen in many organizations that I work with.
Right. I mean, I remember working in retail, working in restaurants, and it had a huge impact on me. I certainly wasn't in the same position where I had trouble making ends meet, but I was able to see kind of the dysfunction and what makes for a good workplace and what makes for a bad workplace. But it seems like, I mean, executives, yes, spending time on the floor is great, but even if they don't spend time on the floor, having a way for those folks on the at the front of house or at the factory floor, giving them the ability to actually control their workplace, maybe communicate some ideas upward. I mean, having a system in place for harnessing and harvesting the insight that they have. I mean, that's something that organizations often do a poor job of, right?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, we've known this for decades. People who are closest to work are the ones who know how to improve the work, and who are the ones who know how to improve customer service in the service world. However, if you want to harness the ideas of those workers, first you need to ensure that you're getting good ideas. If an organization is operating with 100% employee turnover and people come and go,
Yeah.
there will be some variation in the quality of the ideas that come from the front line. Second, you need to have time for people to communicate those ideas to someone in the organization. A lot of organizations don't provide time for enough time to be able to do that. Um, Third, you need to be able to act on those ideas. Many of those ideas require cross-functional teams to solve and implement. And to do all of this, you need to prioritize frontline work and prioritize those workers. And I think maybe part of the reason might be that work in the front lines is not prioritized in the eyes of a lot of leaders. There are other ways to make money. There are other ways to grow sales and grow profits. And improving work is not the primary lever that they use.
Well, let's talk about turnover, right? So the
Yeah.
Toyota production system originated in Japan. Japan famously has lifetime employment. You know, people don't attrit, and then we map it on over to the American environment where we have these much higher attrition rates. And so it doesn't usually work as well. So, I mean, what are the costs of turnover? I think that when senior executives are looking at the cost of turnover, they're mostly focused on the cost of recruiting, right? And the cost of onboarding. And that's really only the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say, Greg, that I'm a proponent for lifetime. I'm for high productivity, high performance, high expectations types of systems. So zero turnover should not be the objective, right? There are some people who are not great fits for an organization, and if they continue to stay, then it's a drag on everybody else. So some level of turnover might be healthy turnover, but what are those costs associated with employee turnover? So what you were alluding to, hiring costs are part of the direct costs of turnover. So what are those direct costs? It's recruiting, hiring, onboarding, training, and time to full productivity. And those costs can be significant, 10 to 20% of payroll. But those tend to be the smallest cost of turnover. The bigger costs tend to be all the operational problems that result from high employee turnover. And this is, in fact, how, as an operations person, I met people. Early on in my career, I was studying retail supply chains. My first project was on forecasting demand for short life cycle products, and then the next one was on inventory management. And what I and my colleagues at the time, this is late 90s, what we have found was when it came to inventory management, retailers were making so many mistakes and having so many problems inside their stores
These
that
are the
were
phantom
preventing them.
stockouts.
Yeah, for products that were actually in the stores were in the wrong place and customers couldn't find them. Inventory related problems, customer service related problems, dirty store, those are the biggest costs associated with employee turnover, because both have direct costs involved, like inventory costs, time, labor, productivity costs. But the biggest cost of these is actually lost sales that result from not having the right product on the floor, or having a long line at the checkout and customers just leave. So those are the bigger cost of employee turnover. And then the biggest cost of employee turnover are what I call system costs. And in the book, I call them corporate disabilities. Because when a company operates with high employee turnover, then it's going to be very difficult for them to hire the right people and train them well, because frontline managers are constantly fighting fires. They're operating in this vicious cycle of high turnover, lots of problems, poor sales and profits, and that cycle continues. And when you don't hire the right people, when you haven't trained them well, you can't trust them to make decisions, which forces us toward like the bureaucracy, the top-down decision making versus empowering people, like you said, to make decisions or to surface ideas that could improve the system. Capacity management becomes very difficult, and it becomes very difficult to consistently have strong managers. Even great managers find it very difficult to survive in these environments. So this is overall a low expectations, low trust system, and at the end, that has competitive costs, because in that system it's harder to adapt to changes, and it's harder to differentiate in the eyes of customers. You can tell
Yeah.
when you go to if you have listeners who live in Texas, like you can tell when you go into an H-E-B store versus when you go into a Kroger store, right? I mean, you can tell the difference as a customer.
Yeah, and this firefighting loop, I mean, this is just one of the kind of low-level equilibrium traps that you talk about. And the other one has to do with trust, right? So when you have this high turnover, the managers don't trust the employees,
Yeah,
right?
managers
And
don't
so,
trust the employees, and the employees don't trust the home office.
yeah, and it reminded me of this joke that they used to tell in the Soviet Union, which was, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So
I think, again, those low trust systems, I mean, we've learned from manufacturing, we've learned from Toyota. We don't even need to look at Russia, right? If you look at the history of auto manufacturing, that's old GM, that's old Ford, and low trust environment, poor quality, low productivity environment. And we've learned since then that it doesn't have to be that way. Even in manufacturing, right? It doesn't have to be that way. You can create a much better system, better for workers and better for company performance.
yeah, I mean, the Numi story is famous,
Yeah.
and it's kind of amazing. I think what percentage of the workforce did Toyota ultimately have to fire? I mean, it
They
was relatively low.
Yeah, I think they started, if I have my numbers right, they started with 85% of the same employees. So the GM factory in Fremont closed in 1982, I think. And a few years later, Toyota comes in, they do a joint venture with GM called Numi, and they reopen the factory. They rehire about 85% of the same workforce, unionized workforce. And yes, and they implement the Toyota production system, and using the same technology, same people, outstanding performance improvements. I mean, it became the most productive U.S. Manufacturing plant, car plant in the United States. So they lost, I think, 6% of the employees or something like that. It's less than 10% because of attendance issues. But most people survived. And I've seen the same thing in our work too. One of the case studies in the book is about Quest Diagnostics. They adopted the Good Job strategy in their call centers. Again, Good Job strategy is a high performance, high expectations, high trust type of system. Not everybody survived, but more than 90% of the people did survive. So when we design organizations for the lowest common denominator, we get that performance from everybody else. When we design it for human beings who have a head, a heart, a mind, and we get different results.
Now, of course, there's a difference between manufacturing and services, and you focus on service operations. Um, what is different? I mean, can you take the insights from, say, manufacturing and
Oh,
back
and
office work and just map it on over? What's the difference? I mean, about having the customer
yeah,
in your
the,
face.
Yeah, the biggest difference is that customers bring a lot of variability into service operations, right? Their arrival varies, what they ask from the service varies, how they evaluate the service varies. So there's a lot more variability that
So
comes
it's a
from
much less controlled environment, right? So in manufacturing, you have many more levers of control over what's going on.
Exactly. And in addition to that variability, customers are operators in many contexts, right? It's like even at a checkout, if those companies that still have checkouts, it's the customer needs to be fast enough, right? Customers can drag down the speed of the checkout if they're too slow. And in so many, even at a doctor's office, the patient needs to describe their systems. Some competence is required from the customer's point. So both customers being operators and bringing a lot of variability is what makes services different. Having said that, so many insights from manufacturing apply to services. In fact, when I look at the 4 operational choices of the good job strategy, focus and simplify, standardize and empower, cross-train, operate with Slack, all of them apply to manufacturing, and they were all in play at Toyota Production System long before I studied service operations.
Well, let's walk through each of them. I want to start with the second one, which has to do with standardization. And so, Frederick Taylor is kind of the founding father of, operations research, right, in a way. And, he emphasizes standardization. And of course, there's pros and cons to the kind of standardization that Taylor encourages. How does standardization, I mean, sometimes standardization is a response to limitations of your workforce, but sometimes standardization can enable, right, and empower your workforce. How should we be thinking about standardization in the workplace?
Yeah, and Greg, I think before we think about standardization of workforce or work, let's think about our mindsets about humans. So, do we see humans as a driver of cost, or do we see humans as a driver of value? Now, if we see humans as a driver of value, we want to maximize that value. And standardization, it has such a bad rep because it comes from the world where people are seen as a cost, and the
Yeah. So you're
objective
like
is
just turning the
minimize that
crank all
cost.
day, just turning the crank,
Turning
right?
a crank all day. They don't have needs. They will obey. They'll follow orders. In that world, of course, standardization is terrible. It crushes human dignity. But in another world where the objective is to maximize productivity, employees' contribution, standardization is liberating because there are so many things that we have to do. If certain things, I don't even have to think about them, right? Mentally, and I can focus on identifying problems, solving customer problems, thinking about improvement. Then in that world, standardization is a gift because there are so many things I don't even have to think about. So I think each of these choices is helpful to say, what are the mindsets that are driving the choices? When used that way, and standardization is not just about work, standardization of management practices. One of the companies that I highlighted in my first book was Mercadona, Spain's largest supermarket chain. They provide great customer service at the lowest possible prices, and they crush it. I mean, they now have more than 25% market share. And when you look at their inventory turnover, labor productivity, profit, in every measure, almost they outperform their competitors. And combination of standardization and empowerment I first saw in their environment when I talked to their managers. I visited 10 stores. I asked them, how do you spend your day? They each tell me the exact same thing. I do this and then this and this. And that standardization, that habit enabled them to get better, but it's not because their dignity, it's not to control them, it's to allow them to contribute even more.
Yeah. So this really requires an understanding of the cognitive load, right,
Yeah.
of the employee. And, what are they actually doing, right, with their brains? And in some sense, you can have too much cognitive load where you just have to
Yeah.
deal with all this stuff. But then there's also you're doing work over and over and over again, which could probably be automated, right? And so you need to find that sweet spot where the employee is engaged in activities that are interesting and meaningful, but aren't taxing the capacities, right?
Yeah, and if something doesn't require judgment, and it's economical to automate it away. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember even, again, I'm going to give the Mercadona example. I studied them almost 15 years ago, and this was my first exposure to a fully automated distribution center in a supermarket context, because supermarket context is different. There are eggs, bananas, like you think about what you can put on top of it. There are lots of different products, and initially it cost them a lot of money, but they had one guiding principle. First, the reason they did it was because people were hurting their backs. Like it's not a great job, but their guiding principle was, we don't like to ask a person to do what a machine can do. We want people to contribute not just their hands, but also their minds and their hearts. So that was the guiding principle. And if we look at I mean, we can talk about automation. I think when used the right way, automation could be a huge enhancer of the good job strategy and better jobs in the future.
Well, yeah, because I mean, that frees up time, right? So if you can automate the things that are kind of sponging up a lot of your time, then you have time to kind of acquire better skills, to rethink what it is that you're doing, to kind of come up with new ideas, maybe pay more attention to the decisions that you're making along the way. And you talk about how many decisions a typical frontline worker makes in a day. I mean, it's amazing, right? Just kind of where to put stuff, and who to talk to and how to respond to customers. These require an enormous amount of discretion.
Yeah, and if we can remove that mental overburden a bit, like you said, and focus on where we can truly leverage human capability, that will be awesome. And again, when it comes to automation, I think just like with standardization, it's not, is it good, is it bad, but it is like, how do we think about labor? If we think about it as a cost, then we're going to approach automation very differently than how we think about labor as a value driver. Because if we think about labor as a value driver, we're going to say, we'll use automation to improve customer value and to make sure that our employees have better jobs, they're more productive, and they can drive that value. It's not like automation is good or automation is bad, but it is how we think about automation in the context of how we think about the role of labor in organizations.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about Home Depot. It's an interesting case, right? So in the early 2000s, when Nardelli took over, he did a lot of good things, right, in terms of the IT and the systems, and making sure that they had good software and hardware in place to keep track of inventory and so forth. But it seemed like there are a bunch of things that he did which delivered only short-term results, right?
Well, now you're taking me back to my first book from 10 years ago. So
Yeah.
remember Nardelli was trained at GE. So he comes from the GE mindset of make the numbers every quarter. And when he first came to Home Depot, yes, Home Depot needed more discipline, more structure, more standardization, more technology. But it's not just the what of bringing things, it's also how of bringing things. And if you do them top down without involving people, you'll end up using technologies that don't work, which was the case of Nardelli. I think they spent like $1 billion on technologies, and they were way behind so many other companies, after years of technology adoption. And so it was without understanding the work, without understanding what's needed, without getting input from the front lines, too many changes all at once. And he told him it's the secret sauce of the customer experience that made Home Depot great. Like they replaced full-timers with part-timers. Home Depot used to have electricians, plumbers, former plumbers working to solve the do-it-yourself customers' needs. and replace them with part-timers who, with all due respect to part-timers, but they did not have the expertise to be able to help the customers. And we saw, their gross margins improved for a while. Things looked better, but then their customer satisfaction dropped below Kmart. And if you remember, Kmart is no longer with us. So it was, we need to combine the operational discipline with the respect for people, respect for work, and with not losing track of what the company stands for in the eyes of customers.
Well, you also talk about simplification, right? So I think, especially marketing people, they have a tendency, let's just add more products, let's add more features, let's have a bunch of different sizes, a bunch of different colors, a bunch of different price points, and so forth. And so this will frequently backfire. Is it because they're not thinking about, in order to do this, you need bigger investment in people. You have to think about, inventory management. There's a whole bunch of things that go along with this that are operational and have nothing to do with marketing.
Yeah, one of the reasons that we have seen companies operate in a vicious cycle of, low investment in people, high turnover, operational problems, low sales, and then this vicious cycle continues. But they can continue to operate in this vicious cycle because they could grow their sales by adding more products. They could grow their sales by adding new services or new promotions. And very soon they realize they don't have a value proposition anymore. Or if they did, they've lost it. And there are so many examples of how adding more and more make things worse. It's very clear to everyone how adding more and more reduces productivity, right? That's probably more clear. But one of the things that I've also seen is how the things that are added by marketing end up really hurting the employee experience and employee turnover. And one big example that I can give you is how constant promotions. So if you go to a store, they might have something on promotion, 2 for 1. And that promotion requires a lot of people to set it up. They have end caps, they have different ways of merchandising and remove it. So when you have constant promotions and sometimes you change the timing of promotions in the last minute, that means that the workload in the store is going up and down, up and down. And if the workload is going up and down, now we can't provide employees stable schedules. Now we're going to have more part-time employees. And most marketing people that I've met, although I don't work a lot with marketing people, but they don't think about the consequences of that promotion on the schedules of their employees, which then affect employee turnover, which then make it very difficult to make sure that when you have a promotion, people will comply to that promotion. Like one of the things that many years ago in early 2000s, everybody was talking about RFID, like RFID will solve our problems. And one of the problems that RFID was supposed to solve is promotion compliance. 50% of the time, promotions are not carried out on time or not at all. Why? Because, well, there are so many of them. Why? Because there's employee turnover, etc. So yes, the tendency is to add and add and add. And what great companies do is they clarify their customer value. If there's no question what value Costco offers its customers, or Four Seasons Hotels offers its customers, or Mercadona or Trader Joe's. And with that clarification, they simplify. And that requires discipline, of course, right? We always have tendencies, even in our personal lives, to add more. And some of these organizations use what organizational psychologists call commitment devices to make sure that they stay disciplined to their customer value proposition.
Yeah, and you're talking about the variability. I think cross-training, one of the components, helps with this so that you can maybe do different activities during lulls in demand, right? And so the people who would normally be maybe on the floor selling can then also kind of restock the shelves at other times when they're not busy and so forth. And so, how important is cross training?
Yeah, I mean it's quite important for many reasons. So if any of your listeners are Trader Joe's customers, they would see. Now I'm going to show standardization and cross training in tandem. So if there's a long line, somebody at the checkout will ring a bell. That's a standardized practice. And when they ring a bell, it means that there's a long line, and somebody shelving merchandise will come and open a cash register. So immediately you see the benefit for the customer, right? The benefit for the customer is responsiveness, that you don't have to wait so long at the checkout because the store is adapting to the customer traffic. The other benefit is that people are always productive. Even when there are no customers, if there are no customers, if you go to Whole Foods, there are no customers, people are at the checkout and waiting because they have nothing else to do. Well, at Trader Joe's, if there are no customers, that person will be cleaning the floor or shelving merchandise or ordering or doing something else. So the second benefit is productivity. And then the third benefit is the job is more interesting when you do a variety of things. I mean, people have found that decades ago. So each of the choices, I mean, we went through standardize and empower, focus and simplify, and cross-training, but each of the choices have a productivity benefit, they have a customer service benefit, and they have an employee experience benefit.
And then the final one, of course, is Slack, right?
Yes.
And so, baking some Slack into the system, and this seems to go contrary, I think, to um, the orthodoxy among some operations folks, right? Which is to be as lean as possible.
But
Slack is a
again,
cost.
like we started, Greg, with the queuing theory, right? This
Yep.
is like Slack is actually as operations theory as any of the other ones. Like it doesn't make sense to target 100% capacity utilization. If you're thinking about inventory management, right? You're trying to figure out how much inventory to stock. If there's some variability in your system and you want to satisfy your customers, you'll never stock the average. You'll have some buffer to deal with variability. So it's the same concept. And what operating with Slack does, and this will bring me to the interconnectedness, is that so operating with Slack is staffing your environment with more hours of labor than the expected workload. It means that people can do a good job. They don't make mistakes. It means that employees are not always firefighting because or making decisions. It means that managers have time to develop people, to improve performance. It means that people can take time off. So these are the benefits of Slack. It means that customer service is better. But operating with Slack doesn't work if the organization has a lot of slackers, right? So operating with Slack also doesn't work if the company, if so it requires a high expectations, high performance system that people use that extra time productively. It also requires the other choices of the good job strategy. So if a company has so many products, so many promotions, if they have high employee turnover, so people make mistakes all the time, adding more time is going to be a very expensive way to improve performance. So Slack works best when the company focuses and simplifies, standardize, cross-trained, and invested in people, so that now that extra time is productive time.
So, look, what are the obstacles? I mean, you spent a lot of time talking about why it's so difficult to convince managers to adopt this strategy. I mean, is it just that these managers have a fixed view of their workforce, that they think they are in fact slackers and that they're always going to be slackers, and that they don't want to look naive, and they don't want to be taken advantage of? Is it that they're engaged in very short-term thinking and focused on making their numbers and not thinking about how that's going to impact the future numbers, because they'll be gone at that point? They'll be moved on to their next career or their next job. Or is it that they're thinking primarily in terms of, A/B testing and prototyping, and you're not going to actually get visible improvements if all you're doing is making small changes on the margin?
I think you've nailed it. And if I were to categorize what you said, so I'll take the experimentation and the mindsets together. So a big reason, as you mentioned, is the mindsets. Like for generations, we've taught managers, leaders that labor is a cost, market pay is the right pay, even if it's not a living wage, even if it causes turnover, lean and mean is what's efficient. And that type of thinking drives that vicious cycle that we taught. And that's the dominant paradigm. But there's another mindset, which is what you mentioned, the A/B testing. A lot of organizations operate in silos. And the good job strategy requires systems thinking, interconnected decisions, and all the decisions coming back to how do we create value for the customer, and how does this interact with other choices to deliver that type of value. And as long as we do the A/B testing and requiring on rigorous, and I don't think it's rigorous, it's math, but it's not rigorous logic, it will be very difficult to adopt this. So first is mindsets. I think the second reason is that the bad job strategy is good enough. You can make money with the bad job strategy. You can, it's like natural selection, right? It's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the fit enough. And a lot of markets are not super competitive, right? So it's not like just the best ones who survive. So that's the second reason. It's profitable. It's good enough. I can give you lots of examples of executives coming to us talking about that. And then I think the third reason is it's harder to do. Like the blueprint for the bad job strategy is a lot simpler. You pay the market, you standardize stuff, you don't give decision rights, you operate with turnover, and you deal with all the consequences. That profit maximization, you can see it. It's a simpler blueprint versus, okay, you need to figure out how much to pay, how to think about career paths, how do you think about how much to empower, because you can't empower people to make all the decisions. So it requires a lot more managerial competence. So I think those three reasons, the ease, the good enough, and the mindsets are the biggest reasons for why there are so few companies doing this.
Well, I
But I
thought some
want
of
to
the most
change that. So.
no, but some of the most interesting observations had to do with private equity, right? So, if in fact the bad job strategy is motivated by quarterly earnings reports, that you have to publish to the public equity markets, then you'd think private equity, with the much longer perspective, would be the driving force in good job strategy. Now, I think historically, right, private equity has, been the lean and mean school. But we're starting to see a lot of private equity companies adopting this viewpoint of yours. And, I do a lot of work with pension funds, and they're trying to figure out which private equity firms to invest in. And so a lot of these private equity firms who are investing in people, of course, they'll paint it with like an ESG brush, right? Because that's very popular. But it's primarily motivated by long-term performance, right? So do you think that, will private equity be one of the drivers going forward, because they do have the ability to resist quarterly earnings temptations?
I think so. And I mean, if you look at people like Pete Stavros at KKR doing amazing work, adopting these types of, it's under ownership umbrella, but employee ownership does not work without employees feeling like owners, employees being empowered, having enough money to pay for their expenses, and employee ownership certainly doesn't work in high turnover settings. So there are, some exemplary leaders like Pete Stavros at KKR doing this in the private equity world. Theoretically, I agree with you, right? They have a longer time horizon, 5 years, even 7-year time horizon, and this could be done within that time horizon. We at the Nonprofit Good Jobs Institute haven't yet had much luck with private equity, although one of the companies that we just completed our work with is an HVAC company, and they're owned by a private equity company. And they're doing this for competitiveness, right? who knows? Maybe in 5 years we'll have a few cases of visionary private equity leaders doing more of this, but we haven't seen it yet, except for KKR's, I think, Pete, and maybe there might be smaller ones that I'm just not aware of.
Well, and speaking of sort of ESG, I mean, throughout your books, you do mention the kind of, I guess, beneficial side effects, right, of justice, equity, and so forth. I mean, do you think that that could sometimes be, I don't know, a distraction? Because for some business leaders, they might find it easy to sell to their investors, right, this impact. But to others, they're going to encounter skepticism, right?
Yeah,
And
I think
they'll be
that,
like,
that
wait, we're not in the business of charity here.
yeah,
We're trying to make money.
and honestly, so I've co-founded the nonprofit Good Jobs Institute. We work with more than 30 companies so far, and we have not yet taken the moral, ethical part as a driving force for doing this. We've taken the competitive reason for doing this, and that competitive reason is we may not be able to grow and survive if we don't improve the value to our customers. We can't improve the value of our customers if we don't have a strong frontline engine. So I'm a business school professor. I care so much on the ethics part. I care so much about the justice. I care so much about, but many business leaders won't be able to keep their jobs if they're not improving performance somehow. And they're under tremendous pressure too. You mentioned earlier, CEO tenure shrinking in organizations. I think maybe something around 5 years now. It might be even less than 5 years. I don't know the most recent data, but their jobs are not a guarantee, and there are many reasons for them to be afraid of this. So unless they can show better performance competitively financially, it will be very difficult for public companies, even for some private companies, to do this. Now, I don't want to say leaders don't care about ethics. They're not more, they do care about ethics. And I think many of them, last week, I was talking to someone who's retiring from Walmart after 35 years of working with the company. And we worked together when he was at Sam's Club. And at Sam's Club, they adopted the Good Job strategy, and it changed the lives of so many employees, and the organization is a much better organization now, competitively, financially, in every way. And he talked about how this was one of the most meaningful work that he's done in his career. And when he reflects on his career, like, this is what he remembers. So a lot of leaders that I've had the privilege of interacting with really care about that ethical side, but they think they can't do it because they need to show results. So we focus on the results, we focus on the outcomes, and doing the right thing is the icing on the cake, I guess. But I wish that when you look at our society now, it's beyond the business conversation, Greg, but it should be in the United States like a patriotic act to do this, because if we all believe that democratic capitalism is the best system, and I think most of us would believe that democratic capitalism is the best system, we would also believe that we can't continue without a strong middle class. And we won't be able to create a strong middle class if we don't bring the low-wage workers into middle class. And we can't do that without creating high productivity companies. So I wish that we had some ensemble of leaders and thinking about the country and the future and say, look, we have to create a strong middle class. We all have to play a role in creating that strong middle class. Again, these are not the competitive reasons that I stress with as in my work with companies, but I wish that the patriotic or civic reason, the ethical reason, were just as important.
And of course, a big part of that is having a promotion path. And we didn't even talk about how important that is. But I guess my last question for you is, how do you see the role of operations in business education, right? Because it seems like, I mean, operations is sometimes tangential to some business schools. It's like, oh, that's engineering, right? Like, so put that over in the engineering school. But it seems like, I mean, operations is so central to what management is all about. Can operations sometimes be too isolated from the other aspects of business? How do we make sure that operations is fully integrated into areas like HR? And I think this is increasingly important because we're dominated by the service sector, right? It's manufacturing has become less important, but I think a lot of what happens in operations is still focused on manufacturing models.
I don't know. Maybe we need to have a campaign for making operations cool again, for making operations. eh, You can go through the MIT Sloan education. I'll talk about my school. We only have one semester of core curriculum, so the other 3 semesters are elective. So you can go through the entire MBA curriculum without having taken a single operations course.
Well, we had three in my core program at Wharton when I was there. So three separate operations course in the core. But the
In the
dean was, of
core.
course, an operations professor, so he did that. I don't think they do that anymore.
I mean, I think operations is where spreadsheets meet value is created, right, for the customer, where spreadsheets meet humans and natural resources. I can't understand how someone could be a great manager without having operational knowledge, yet it's not as cool. I don't know how to change that, except for creating great courses. I mean, one thing we could do as operations faculty is create great courses that our students want to take. And at MIT Sloan, even though operations is not a required course, a lot of MIT students end up taking operations because they want to take the courses.
Well, make operations cool again. Maybe you can, print up some hats and pass them around. And of course, this would be sort of a required text for that initiative. Zeynep, thanks so much for joining me. I really
Thank
appreciate
you
it.
so much for having me.
The book is called Case for Good Jobs. Thanks again.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.